So recently, I was scrolling on YouTube Shorts as I do, when I came across this video. And that got me thinking, there's definitely gotta be way weirder cars out there. And how weird can they get? In the year 2000, this car, called the Helicron, was found in a shed, apparently having been abandoned sometime in the 1930s. It was found in pieces without its original engine, but soon after it was discovered, it was fully restored by its new owners to its former glory. So, the Helicron was a prototype vehicle. It was never produced, yet somehow it survived the test of time, despite the fact when it was found in 2000, it had been in that shed for nearly 70 years. Unlike most cars, the Helicron uses a giant spinning propeller, as you can obviously see, to drive across roads, off-roads, and even through city streets where people are. Now, no one knows who actually built the car, but it was definitely somebody who worked on airplanes. Also, even though this car looks like it's meant to be a human shredder, it's actually totally allowed on public roads. Well, in France. And still, I'd rather be hit by an F-150.
And take a look at this. One of the 6 Oscar Mayer Wienermobiles crashed into a house yesterday.
Now this next car coming up is my personal favorite. Originally created in 1936, the idea for a giant wiener-shaped car to advertise those amazing, zestly-shaped dogs of meat comes from the brilliant mind of Carl Mayer, the nephew of Oscar Mayer. Many different versions of the Wienermobile have, do, and will probably exist in the future. But the one you're probably most familiar with is the model designed and released to the public back in 2004. Now, compare it to the one built back in 1936, it's a huge difference. It's not even fair, honestly. I mean, the original didn't even have windows or glass. It was just open. And while looking at pictures on the internet can be fun, if you ever find the Wienermobile, take a picture. No lie, these things are actual cryptids and will disappear if you look away for a second. Everyone knows the Ford Model T, and most people know it was the first mass-produced car ever back in 1908. And while that was great and all and set up the next century for climate change, people forget that in a crash, you'd go flying through broken glass. It was just glass. You could also explode because the gas tank was put directly under where you were sitting. Also, the Ford Model T only had rear brakes, which doesn't sound like a bad thing, but if the rear brakes broke and you were going downhill, you were not gonna stop. You had to jump out before your car just crashed, and that thing was fully made out of metal. And if you had to go up a steep hill, you had to drive the car in reverse because the car's engine was fed by gravity. That meant your car had way less fuel than it needed. And apparently reverse had way more horsepower than driving forward. That's why the Ford Model T is on the list. Even though it was a very common car back in the early 1900s, because there was no one regulating car manufacturers, Henry Ford got away with a lot of very bad and just not safe decisions. And Ford kept producing these cars and added very little over the years until his son eventually convinced him to add more safety features, which eventually created Ford's next car, the Model A.
Look how they massacred my boy.
Now imagine you're challenged to make a modern day version of this car, a 1950s classic Chevrolet pickup. I mean, look at it, it's so nice, but how do you think you could modernize this car? It's alright, take a second. Alright, pencils down. How many of you came up with this? I certainly didn't. This is the 2003, yes, 2003 Chevrolet SSR, a real-life Hot Wheels car you could drive around. Actually, wait, my bad. They only made a Matchbox one. When this car came out, it sold a lot less than what Chevy expected. It sold so bad, in fact, that only 3 years after production started, the factory producing the SSR was closed. And what's even weirder is that the car had around 300 horsepower for the base model. In comparison, a 2025 Honda Civic has around 150 horsepower. That's 300 horses worth of power. Also, the Chevrolet SSR sounds like a good name. SSR actually stood for Super Sport Roadster. And so to me, that sounds really cool, but it just does not match the look of the car. Though I can't give it this. It was once almost used to beat a land speed record, but it never got over 200 miles per hour. But imagine driving this thing at over 200 miles per hour. That is insane. Anything over that is insane.
And then there's the brakes. They're very sharp, and you need to remember that. because if you push the pedal too hard, the whole thing will fall on its face.
Absolutely tiny and really stylish, this is the BMW iZeta. It was a car that was designed and released in the 1950s by the BMW Group. So the story of this car is that back before BMW made this car, they basically only produced luxury cars. And despite the fact they were selling them for such high prices, they just did not make enough to stop them from going bankrupt. So very quickly, they designed and produced the iZeta to be easy to make and cheap to buy for the average person. The least weird thing about this car is that it used a motorcycle engine. In the 1950s and 60s, small cars like the iZeta were super popular, and they basically all used motorcycle engines. Now, besides the looks, the weird thing about the car is that you actually got in using the front. There was no side doors. You literally went to the front of the car and then opened it up and sat down and pulled the front on top of you. Also, look at what people are doing to these cars. They're going absolutely insane, adding anything they can find. I mean, what even is that? This just represents how weird and wacky that people who buy these cars were and still are. Alright folks, now it's time to talk about the thumbnail. The Chrysler Turbine was a car that looked super normal on the outside, but it had a really dark secret. Under its hood, it had an A831 turbine engine, or better known as a freaking jet engine. And because it wasn't a regular gas combustion engine, it didn't need regular car parts, like a cooling system, a radiator that helped cool the engine with antifreeze, crankshafts, or any other type of part you can find in a gas engine. This also meant that the Chrysler Turbine didn't need much maintenance, if any. If you bought a new car today, within 3 years, you would have done more maintenance on your car than the Chrysler Turbine has had its entire lifetime. It could also start up in temperatures as low as negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 29 degrees Celsius. This car could run on anything that was burned. Regular gas was just as good as jet fuel to this monstrosity of a car. I mean monstrosity as a good thing. At one point, during a gala in Paris, Chrysler even filled the car with perfume and drove it around, while the exhaust smelled like a bouquet of flowers. At a second point, one of the presidents of Mexico, Adolfo Mateos, got Chrysler to let him drive it around with tequila. But you're probably thinking, why wasn't this car produced if it was so amazing? Well, the engine was very, very expensive. It was so expensive that basically no one besides Chrysler knows how much it costed to make the engine. And that's why it's the weirdest car on this list.